Hey.
Hey, Chris.
How are you doing?
Calling Chris Anderson in...
I am in Berchtesgaden. Does it look like Berchtesgaden?
Oh, wow. So do you have a virtual background back there?
I do. I got to get some of those, because I keep traveling. Maybe we could,
they all look like... put up a virtual background of wherever you are. And then...
They would all look like Novotels, but, that's...
But I'm in Chicago.
Are you still... Wait, you're still in Chicago?
I'm still in Chicago, still wearing the same clothes I wore last week.
They haven't whisked you off to Berlin?
Not yet, no. Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for making the show possible. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you are watching live, replay, or listening on the HHH podcast, we appreciate the fact that you're here.
Very much.
And today we are going to present an encore of our show from 3 years ago on the Canadian Black Watch at Verrières Ridge. Yes. So this is a story of the Canadians, and you and I have. I mean, you've been there many times. Yeah. I have been there a couple of times with you. I think I know at least once.
And it was a transformational experience, wasn't it?
It was pretty amazing, and especially when we walked kind of past where the ridge was, and some of it's a little blurry in my memory, but it was a pretty extraordinary day that the Canadians fought there, and it's a great story.
Yeah, so I'm glad we got them back on.
Yeah, so hey, everybody, let us know what you're drinking and what's going on with you. And while you're doing that, I will mention that we appreciate our HHH Top Shelf patrons.
Was it august people? August personages? Was that what we...
I don't know. They're distinguished.
Distinguished. Okay.
And financially well off. At least well enough off to be Top Shelf patrons. And we appreciate everybody who is a patron. And you can become a patron of historyhappyhour.com. And we'll start a page 2 for you.
Be the first person on page 2. That's something to aspire to.
Well, you'd have to have a name that began with Y or Z, because it'd have to come after.
You're gonna do the alphabet. Yeah, okay.
It is. Did you not notice?
No, I just, after I said that,
alphabetical order.
My keen powers of observation. Yeah.
Come on. So that's pretty much something that we appreciate everybody doing.
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm blah blah blahing now, so you have to give me a cue, and let's start this show.
The bar is open.
The bar is open, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm very excited, as I guess you figured out, about the show this week. Our guest this week is David Keefe, and David is a professor of history at Marianopolis College. If you are living in Canada, you will probably recognize him. He has written, produced, and appeared in a number of documentaries that were widely seen in Canada. Probably most well known as Dieppe Uncovered and the Black Watch Snipers. And he is the co-creator of the History Channel's War Junk television show. When he's not, wasting time doing all of that, he's writing books, amongst which are One Day in August, The Untold Story Behind Canada's Tragedy at Dieppe, and 7 Days in Hell, which we'll be talking about this week. He has received numerous awards, lots of them with royal and official in the title. But for our purposes, he's also a veteran of the Black Watch of Canada. But despite all of these accomplishments, he felt there was something missing. And it was because he had yet to appear on History Happy Hour, so we're going to give him an opportunity to scratch that itch. So, David, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Very historic moment, without a doubt. Certainly.
Could be the pinnacle of your career.
I think it is. And we better be recording.
Oh, okay? Yes.
Don't worry.
Happy Easter. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter to you. Did you bring a cocktail to Happy Hour?
Yes, I did. Something rather appropriate, a little single malt for today, considering we're talking about the Black Watch.
Wonderful. Excellent.
And Rick,
I have, a beer in my psychological operations glass, so that's the persuade, change, and influence. Oh, hold on. There's something happening over here. Okay. Okay. It definitely must be Easter.
It's the Vorpal Bunny.
Either that or it's the buddy from Monty Python.
Yeah, I was going to say
One of
that's
the
what I thought.
Yeah.
This is a surprise to me, and we'll be talking about this later. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
And befitting our happy and cheery topic today.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Well, for our topic today is...
Thank you.
We're going to be talking about one very special regiment in the Canadian Army, the Black Watch of Canada, and basically focusing in on 1 week in Normandy, one terrible week for the regiment. And it's something that I think is an important book, not only because it tells the story of a regiment that I care a great deal about, but it also, I think, does a really wonderful job of illustrating just how terrible the fighting in Normandy really was. And I think sometimes we sort of lose sight of that. We talk about the guys land on the beach, and then,
Yeah.
but what we're going to talk about today happens a month after the landing, and it's just horrific. So we'll get into the weeds here. So, David, for starters, just for, since we have a lot of Americans in the audience, can you tell us a little bit about what the Black Watch is and why it's such a special regiment? And
Sure.
kind
Yeah,
of
I guess
background?
in Canada, the Black Watch of Canada, and there is an Imperial Black
Yep.
Watch over in Scotland. So, and the Black Watch here took their name from that just before the First World War, and kind of earned their spurs in the trenches of the First World War. And as a matter of fact, when they come out of the trenches in 1918, they are very much in the Canadian Army scheme of things, very much the way we would see the New York Yankees of baseball, Montreal Canadiens, Manchester United. They are the creme de la creme, and certainly they know that. They recruited, and of course, up here in Canada, we're along the lines of the British tradition, or at least we were at this time. In other words, we have regiments which are recruited from certain regimental areas. And the Black Watch is Montreal based. When Montreal used to be the center of the universe in Canada, now of course it's Toronto, but when Montreal was the mover and shaker of Canada, the Black Watch of course was able to recruit heavily, not only here but other parts as well. We'll get into that in a bit. But they perpetuated 3 battalions, which was unheard of, and they were able to sustain 3 battalions for about 2 years. 2 of them fought through the entire war. 1 of them was in and out relatively quickly. But the big claim to fame for the Black Watch was all 3 of them were standing essentially shoulder to shoulder together at Verrières Ridge when Verrières Ridge was captured in 1917, which is the pinnacle of Canadian military history.
Right.
So you can imagine, and when they came out of the trenches, they had the most battle honors of any regiment. They had the most individual honors. 6 Victoria Cross recipients were part of their ranks. And they emerged with an attitude and a swagger, well earned, but it was something that they definitely took into World War II, without a doubt.
Yeah. Now, David, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there are a number of Americans that the regiment had a tradition of recruiting in America from the First World War.
Yeah, it's probably one of the best kept secrets of the Black Watch. Was in World War I to help fill out the ranks of those 3 battalions. We were pretty much soaking Montreal dry, so we ended up moving down and going towards the Boston area, into Philadelphia, New York as well. So you had a relatively sizable contingent of Americans who decided they were going to join the Black Watch before the United States was in World War I. Well, the same thing happens in World War II. In 1939, 40, and 41, before Pearl Harbor, you see Americans who, for whatever reason, they decide they want to get into the war for their own reasons, mostly because they figured it was the right thing to do. We're looking for a ride, if you will. And a lot of times the Black Watch name that had come out of World War I, of course, had a real brand recognition in the United States. So, there's certainly at least one gentleman that I talk about in the book, Bill Booth, came up from Florida. And he came up from Florida because he thought he was joining the Black Watch in Scotland and had no clue that there was a Canadian Black Watch.
Geography is not always the strong point of many Americans.
Yeah, well, at least he found the Black Watch. That was his main objective.
Right.
Yeah, he was thinking of going to India, as a matter of fact. I think if I'm not mistaken, he had seen the Shirley Temple classic Wee Willie Winkie, which happened to have the Black Watch in it. He just thought one Black Watch was the other Black Watch and ended up in Montreal. So there you go.
Well, looking at the story in Normandy, I guess I would say we should get a little background here on how this battalion that's part of a regiment in Canada, how it ends up in Normandy, where it ends up, what they're doing, and they're under, of course, the British command there in Normandy.
Yeah, they are. I mean, overall British command, if you will. I mean, like everybody.
Right. I mean, they're reporting to the British.
Montgomery's,
yeah.
exactly, under Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Yeah, they arrive, and Chris mentioned it right off the top. A lot of times when we look at Normandy, we look at Saving Private Ryan, we look at the opening on Omaha Beach, and we figured, oh my God, they overcame it, and that was it. The Germans packed up shop and went home. But what we tend to forget is, over the next 76 days, Normandy devolves into a slugfest. And it is almost up there when it comes to the percentage of losses as you would find in World War I at Passchendaele or the Somme. I mean, this is a heavy infantry slog, and a lot of people tend to forget that, and certainly the Americans in the bocage, but also with the British and the Canadian forces that have landed on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches and have pushed up to the Norman capital of Caen. And it's taken a while for them to actually reach Caen, the city. And then the Germans basically abandon it. The Canadians and the British take it. But then there's the big defensive area south of Caen, which is the Verrières Ridge or feature, that really then becomes the main hinge in the entire German defense in Normandy. And it takes about 6 weeks of tough fighting, tough, hard-nosed fighting, like I said, a real infantry slugfest, to be able to just sort of wrestle to that point by the end of July. And there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear within Allied high command that the Germans are going to somehow be able to wrestle them into a standstill or a stalemate. And that's something that has huge operational and political, potential political repercussions, because of course in the United States, you have FDR, who's just announced that he is going to run for the 4th consecutive term. So there's a lot of political pressure that's being put on Eisenhower for a relatively quick victory in Normandy. But the reality on the ground is not playing nice for the politicians. And of course, that's also creating a huge amount of strain on the relationship between Montgomery and Eisenhower. And of course, Montgomery is, responsible for the day-to-day actions. He's got the 1st Army, the U.S. Army, he's got the 2nd British Army. And under that, the 2nd Canadian Corps arrives in late July. And the Black Watch are part of the 5th Brigade of the 2nd Canadian Division, part of the 2nd Canadian Corps of 2nd British Army. So that's where the order of battle comes in. And they're inserted into the line after about 10 days of what they call inoculation. And they're inserted south of Caen, or actually just in the middle of Caen, to be honest with you. And their first kick of the can, or their first chance at battle, is July 18th, 1944, which is the first of the 7 days that I cover in the book.
So, David, leading up to this, just again, so to familiarize some of the Americans in the audience, I want you to describe kind of some of the Canadian personalities or commanders, because obviously we know about Bradley and we know about Hubner and Maxwell Taylor, but who are some of the kind of the decision makers that the Canadians are working with here?
Well, this time it's very interesting because the Canadians come into Normandy in a very incremental way. In other words, we don't arrive with 1st Canadian Army. 1st Canadian Army eventually sets itself up once there's enough elbow room in the bridgehead, okay? So basically we have 1 Canadian division and an armored brigade, the 3rd Canadian Division, which lands on D-Day and continues to fight. So around July 6th is when the rest of the 2nd Canadian Division arrives, and now we set up the 2nd Canadian Corps. And that is under Guy Simmons, Lieutenant General Guy Simmons. And you notice I said lieutenant, not lieutenant, right? Yep. Because we're dealing with Canadian and British ranks. So Lieutenant General Guy Simmons, you can see him in the middle. And he was considered by some to be Canada's ablest general, perhaps their greatest general. He was a Montgomery protege, as you could see. He wore the beret like him, had the mustache like him. He was tough, he was stern, he was autocratic in his command style. He was a gunner by training. He was from the artillery arm. And he had been number 1 at Royal Military College, which is our version of West Point. And he was a mover and shaker. He had fought in Sicily, had a division command in Sicily and in Italy, and then was promoted. And this was going to be his big debut. And under his corps, now you have the Armor Brigade, the Canadian Armor Brigade that is fighting, but you also have the veteran 3rd Division, which slammed ashore at Juno Beach and has been fighting ever since. And now the 2nd Canadian Division, whose claim to fame up until this point was that one day in August in 1942 where they were mercilessly ripped apart on the shores of Dieppe, and now this was the first time they were getting back into battle. And they have a commander by the name of Major General Charles Fowkes, who was the one I believe on the left of the photograph. Yeah, you can see my left, or and,
it's to the left. It's
to the left.
It's everybody's
Okay,
left.
somebody's left.
It's everybody's left.
Yes, he's the one looking to the right, and he has his finger pointed down. Yeah, you can see it with his name.
With his name under. That's
with
one
his
way
name
to know.
under. I mean, that's probably the easiest way to figure out who it is. Yeah, exactly. Fowkes was interesting. Nobody could really figure out how Fowkes reached the rank he did. As a matter of fact, he was probably, and I think I'm being overly fair here to say he was probably one of the biggest and best brown-nosers in the entire Canadian Army.
That's the positive view.
It actually said, don't laugh, it is. I mean, it says that in his file. One of the big strengths is his ability to please his masters, basically, is what it's saying. So, but Simmons really didn't like him. He had problems of personality, to say the least. And then, of course, one of the big problems was he had no experience in battle. Simmons did. And so everything that Simmons did, it wasn't a question of, jump. It was, how high do you want me to jump? Right. And that trickles down in 2nd Canadian Division. That goes not only from Fowkes, but also down to the brigade commander, where the Black Watch is in, 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade. McGill, Brigadier William McGill. It's M-E-G, okay, not M-C, like the university. And he is a signaler by trade. He was in wireless all his life, and he was in what we call the tiny permanent force. Before the war, Canada only had a very tiny army of about maybe 10,000 people, 10,000 men at that time. And so as a result, there was a clique that developed, and you had the militia-trained soldiers and officers like those in the Black Watch. So in other words, these were not so much National Guard, but not too far off. And then you had somebody like McGill, who made his career in the armed forces. And so there is a common understanding that there was two strains, if you will, of the commanders. Those who could go back to civilian life if they screwed up on the battlefield because they had their own fortunes, and those like McGill who were company men, and this was their entire profession. So some people have suggested he was promoted way above his ceiling because of the fact he had nowhere else to go after becoming a colonel. And the only way he could become a general was to actually command troops in battle. So that's the overall scenario, for the
the dynamic between those guys. I mean, and we can touch on this again later, but briefly, it's a dynamic that essentially helps pave the way to disaster for the Black Watch, isn't it?
Without a doubt, it's I would argue, and I did in the book, completely dysfunctional. You have two subordinates in your division commander and your brigadier who are terrified to take the initiative because they know that Simmons is extremely, like I said, extremely autocratic. He's extremely arrogant because, he has battle experience. As a matter of fact, at one point he said, look, when the music starts playing, you just follow it and I'll call the variations. In other words, you just follow what I have to say. Don't bother thinking for yourself.
I can't be wrong.
No, exactly. I can't be wrong. But what this does is it creates a paralysis of initiative, if you will, down at the lower levels. Because, as you can be removed and it doesn't matter how far up the chain you are, and it doesn't matter how good your intelligence is and your communications are. There is a certain amount of understanding of the nuance at the front line, and you have to be able to have that rapport that moves back and forth with your units in the front to be able to have, as the Germans call it, a fingertip feel of what's going on in the field. Simmons is not like that. Simmons is very much like a maestro. In other words, here's the concerto, everybody follow the music, and if I decide, and when I decide, and only I decide, when we're going to change. Well, and so that becomes a very, very difficult command climate, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things I'm curious about is obviously with the Black Watch, you're I think it's fair to say you're dealing with some ego.
Oh yeah.
And they have over them this kind of dysfunctional command structure. So as they're going into combat at Normandy, do you have any sense of, are the guys in the regiment saying, "Who are these clowns above us?" or "It's all good," or
Oh, yeah.
are they? What's their kind of
Part of the Black Watch attitude, as I mentioned, or mystique, as we termed it earlier, is the fact that nobody is going to tell the Black Watch how to do something. In other words, you can tell us what needs to be done, just don't tell us how to do it. And part of that had to do with this incredible legacy coming out of World War I. And also, too, you do have, like, for instance, the colonel who is leading the Black Watch into battle, Stuart Cantley, graduated, like Simmons, #1 from Royal Military College. So there is, there is some professional egos here. But also, you remember that the Black Watch is made up specifically of working class kids from the Anglophone areas of Montreal, predominantly the Irish and the Scots and the English. And then you have their officers, and their officers are all coming from the movers and shakers of Canada. They're all captains of industry, politicians. One of the men that I follow in this is the Prime Minister's nephew, the former Prime Minister, R.B. Bennett. His nephew is one of the company commanders. And so the Black Watch is known as kind of like the old family regiment. In other words, it's a blue chip regiment, if you will. So any time that any kind of decision is made, the Black Watch are sure to put their voices out there. In other words, they're sure to be heard, if you know what I mean. In other words, you better do right by our regiment.
right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't start off too well. So on the 18th,
No.
their hard knocks start right out of the gate. There's very little in the
There's no
gradual
easing
transition.
into this.
Yeah,
No,
no.
there's no easy. I mean, they do, they land on the 6th, like the rest of it, the 6th of July. And then they spend about 12 days in this inoculation. So basically, they're going around doing some patrols and sniper hunting and things like this, and just getting used to what it's like being under fire for the first time. Because remember, they've essentially sat in England training for 4 years up until this point. The only time they sent one company, 120 men into Dieppe, and they never came back. So they replaced that company. But you can imagine what it's like. And, think about, we're all sports fans here. We were talking about that before we came on. You can only play so many Grapefruit League games before you start to get stale, right? You've got to be able to see action. And, of course, combat, you can be so well trained for it, but there's no substitute for experience. There are a billion little things, particularly in infantry combat, that you need to be able to pick up on the field of battle that you're not going to get training in England. So as well trained as you are still green when you're going into battle. There's no substitute for combat. So that's basically what we're getting now, is that the Black Watch, as you mentioned, go into battle on July 18th, and they're given the honor of leading the division and its breakout through Caen over a little part of the Orne River in the southern part of Caen. If you've ever been to Caen, you know what it's like. You drive through to the south as you're heading south towards Verrières, and it's a tiny little river. I mean, it's only about maybe 30 yards wide. And this is their first show. And they're told to basically bounce the Orne. And it's supposed to be relatively simple. They're supposed to be going against German rear guards, because the Germans are pulling back now. They pulled out through Caen. They're moving back towards Verrières Ridge. And opening night jitters. That's about it. Somebody, after training for 4 years, misses or mixes up a simple timing. What time do they have to be in position to cover the troops that are going to make this assault boat crossing across the river? And it goes off the rails really quick. And an entire company of the Black Watch, 120 men, are lost just trying to get across this river, which was supposed to be a very simple way of, kicking in the door and moving on. And that was, I guess you could say, a warning of what was to come for them in some cases.
Yeah.
So that's the beginning of the 7 days in hell, in essence, and it's very bad at the beginning. Then things improve a bit, and set us up for to take us to what happens on July 25th, which is the day that they launched their assault at at Verrières Ridge, and so how does this what is this assault part of what's happening that puts them
Okay.
in the position that they're going to be there?
Okay. Well, they start off, like I said, on the 18th, and this is part of the Canadian subsidiary operation known as Atlantic. It's part of Montgomery's Goodwood operation. And as they cross the river, they basically, they take it on the chin, and their pride is hurt without a doubt. And then in the next series of engagements, they're able to capture a German outpost, and then they're called in when there's an emergency. The Germans launch a counterattack from Verrières as General Simmons, fighting his first battle, overextends one of the other brigades, the 6th Brigade. And so as a result, they get hit by some very tough customers. They get hit by the 1st SS Panzer Division. And as you can imagine, these are veterans of the Eastern Front who play for keeps, to say the least. And so as a result, there's a lot of panic in 2nd Canadian Division. And the Black Watch are thrown up to restore the line on a godforsaken hill called Hill 61. And if you've ever been to Verrières, it actually is slightly below Verrières and across the valley. So any of the Germans on Verrières have a perfect view of everything that's happening on Hill 61. So the Black Watch end up inheriting this place. And basically they're an exposed advanced slope where they have to dig in wheat, because the whole area is covered in wheat. And they, of course, the French have been evacuated. They haven't been harvesting. So now the wheat is standing literally waist or shoulder high.
And we should, and I just to interrupt, just because for people who've been to Normandy, I think most of our American visitors to Normandy are in hedgerow country. This is not really hedgerow country. This is more open fields of wheat rather than a tiny little hedgerow of wheat.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing that changes the dynamic. When you have, you're fighting in the bocage country, it's very short, sharp fights. Here, it's very much like World War I, as I mentioned, up in Flanders, where you are advancing steadily and relatively slowly up a steady incline for 2 or 3 kilometers or, a mile and a half at a time. So this is very difficult, which requires then that all the elements of your force come together. So in other words, the artillery, the tank support, the Air Force, if they're available, etc., to be able to cover that kind of ground without being massacred. But, to get there, that was one of the big problems. When the Black Watch ended up on Hill 61 and they had to stay there for 4 days, it kind of reminds me, and I've said this before, in Band of Brothers, in, the Ardennes, the Bastion. They have their Bastion for the Black Watch right out of the gate. There's no winter, there's no cold, but they're getting, high temperatures, and then one day it'll be raining, and the next day it'll be high heat. And then, of course, they're in an environment that they've never trained in, because in England, and a lot of people don't realize this, you could not train in wheat because it was scarce and they were using it for food. So you were prohibited from going into wheat fields. So now you're in a completely foreign environment where you have to dig in with the wheat all around you. And of course, you're facing an enemy who has fought in this terrain for 3.5 years in Russia, and they know all the tricks of the trade.
Well, yeah, I think it's important for people to know that, the opposition, particularly against the Canadians, this isn't, Russian conscripts or Ost volunteers or unit. This is they're going up against the A team. And one quote I wanted to read. This is from your book. This is from an American who's fighting with the Canadians, Robert Rigg, and he says, "The SS were unmitigated bastards in every sense of the word. They were all psychopaths, totally imbued with the filthy Nazi credo and remorseless killers of both prisoners and wounded. They were hated by the Wehrmacht almost as much as by us. The ordinary Jerry would fight one hell of a battle, but if all was lost, he would surrender or retreat. Not the SS. They fought to the death, and they were killed as they deserved." This is brutal stuff. This is not...
Yeah, and it's very symbolic of the relationship. Of course, I'm not sure if any of your viewers would know, but the Canadians and the British had a very difficult time with the 12th SS Panzer Division on D-Day and the days leading. Close to 300 British and Canadian prisoners were murdered by members of the 12th SS over a couple of days after D-Day. So by the time that this is all cooking and you've got the rest of the SS divisions coming in, you can imagine the kind of relationship that has been built up, particularly between Canadian units and the SS. Yeah. And as you mentioned, it is the A team. The best that Hitler has left to throw, he's doing it. I mean, they've got the 1st SS, the Hitler bodyguard. They have what's left of the 12th SS. They're battle groups of the 2nd Panzer Division, which is one of the best that the Wehrmacht have to offer. Plus you have the 2 Panzer Divisions, SS Panzer Divisions, that would later make their fame and fortune, if you will, at Arnhem, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Division. So, you are literally going up against the best in what essentially is your first battle. So I don't think you could have much more of a David and Goliath kind of matchup going in to start.
Well, and I want to take a look at what happened on the 25th, and I did not take this from your book. I was looking for a simplified version of this map, but in essence, the Black Watch on the left, they're part of a larger attack, which is, I think, Operation Spring. Is that right?
Yes, Operation Spring. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you see, there's an attack going on by the Canadians, the infantry, the various parts of it, and they're going to be trying to attack towards this town, Fontenay-le-Marmion, and to do that, they have to go over this ridge, Verrières Ridge, and that's kind of the sticking point. And they hope to have tank support for this. Doesn't quite work out, and it ends up, honestly. David, reading your book, it feels a little bit, it's a smaller scale. It feels a little, what happens feels a little bit like Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg, So tell us what goes on there. Give us the overview.
Well, essentially, I mean, by the time we get to it, it's a locomotive that's, going off the rails. The entire train is a runaway train by the time the Black Watch actually make their attack. One of the big problems, of course, is General Simmons, Guy Simmons, is trying to, I would argue, impress. He's trying to make his mark. He would like to get Verrières Ridge. He wants it as his Vimy Ridge of World War II. And so as a result, he comes up with a monster of a plan. It's overly complex. It's overly complicated. It has a series of phases, basically 3 phases plus an option depending on how you're doing at the end. And it's overly ambitious. Given the fact that the Germans, over the preceding days leading up to this attack on July 25th, are pulling out all the stops and moving their reserves south of the ridge. He understands he's getting top-notch intelligence either through signals intelligence or he's getting it through ultra. He knows what it's looking like, and he starts scaling it back a little bit in his mind. He was hoping to break through originally.
But even his commander, right? Even General Dempsey, the British commander, doesn't think this is really going to work. But he's sort of like, well, okay, you can try. I'll give you a little rope, but not too much.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, because what's happening is they're looking at the intelligence picture and they're realizing that Verrières Ridge every single day leading up to the 25th is becoming a tougher nut to crack. So it starts off in the planning around the 19th of July as this breakthrough operation. In other words, let's reach Falaise, let's finish off what Goodwood couldn't do. And then the sober reality for most people, most of the commanders start to sink in, and eventually Dempsey has to kind of rein in Simmons to a tad, and he actually puts a time limit on this. So he basically says, if you don't get the ridge by noon on the 25th, and the operation is supposed to start in the middle of the night. So basically he's got about 8 hours to get the ridge. Then Dempsey is going to call it off. But this becomes one of the problems. We understand why Dempsey is doing this, but basically Simmons does not interpret this as a word of caution. I would argue he sees it more of a challenge. In other words, now I have till noon to get the ridge, as opposed to, okay, let's see how things go and we'll reassess and we'll do it,
Right.
properly.
So he reads it like the people in the TV shows when when they say it's going to take 2 hours and the boss says get it done in 30 minutes, and so he's like, all right, get it done in 30 minutes.
Yeah, and actually that's the kind of attitude he takes. And, the problem is he's got this incredibly complex and complicated plan, which is based on timing. And when you have timings wed to your plan as your, primordial mechanism, you're already in trouble before the plan starts. Because inevitably, the Germans are going to throw off your timing. I mean, they're masters of defense by this time. They are wilting away, and they're nowhere near as super as a lot of people claim they were. But they understand how the game is played, and they know how to get you off kilter. Pardon me. And that's exactly what happens. And so they know that spring is coming. They know Operation Spring, I should say. They know essentially because of all the, the artillery that's ramping up, and the two Allied armored divisions, which are queuing up in the back to try to push through if Simmons gets the ridge. They know something big is about to happen. So they end up getting the first strike in, and they send, believe it or not, an airstrike, a series of airstrikes, which is unheard of at this time. And that's how desperate the Germans were. They send a series of airstrikes at night, and they're quite successful in hitting Canadian and British command, control, and communication facilities, which immediately then throws everything off kilter. And so basically, Operation Spring, gets behind time. They're supposed to be trying to assault Verrières at night. In other words, in the darkness, and the last push is going to be right at dawn before the Germans really have a good view. But unfortunately, they're about 6 hours behind. So in other words, instead of the Black Watch going in at 5:30, it's now 9:30, and they're still trying to fight to get to their start line because all hell has broken loose during the night. So now, if you're in the Black Watch, you're sitting there looking up at Verrières Ridge. The Germans, of course, are on the reverse slope in full strength. And now it's broad daylight. There's no mist. There's no half light. It is now a bright, shiny, sunshiny day. They haven't seen sun in a week. And now suddenly it comes out. And of course, so now the only thing that they have to rely on is, as they're making their way for almost 2.5 kilometers straight up the ridge and then over the ridge down onto that target that you showed before, their objective, the town of Fontenay-le-Marmion, they have a series of artillery concentrations that are going to come down and provide, if you will, a wall of steel. And they're going to have support from a squadron, actually, of tanks, Sherman tanks, that are going to come in apparently from the flanks. And then they're going to provide direct fire as the indirect fire comes down, and then basically they're going to move it right up the ridge and then down onto their target. So you can imagine that, everything has to come off according to plan and like clockwork for this to work. And of course, as you know, in combat, nothing ever goes according to plan. You have to have your branches and your sequels, and that's just not built in.
Well, I just find it unforgivable. I mean, Simon's obviously this is his first big battle, but he'd been in Italy. I'd like to get into the kind of the details of the attack, but I've been to where the attack goes in. Unfortunately, when I was there, your book hadn't been written yet, but you just want to weep when you see the ground.
That seems to be quite the theme in Canadian military history, whether it be at Dieppe or whether it be in Normandy. There's a lot of times, and of course, the Canadians do have tradition of accepting whatever job is given to them, and will die attempting to do it. We did that in World War I. That's why we ended up with our, the reputation we did coming out of the trenches. And in World War II, you could probably argue it was the same thing. And in microcosm, it's like that for the Black Watch. To get back to what you were talking about before, Simmons, I think Simmons doesn't understand really infantry. He doesn't understand the infantry battle, and he doesn't understand armor. He is a gunner, and everything is about the fire plan. And he was quite successful, one would argue, as a division commander. But you're dealing with a different level when you have a corps that is made up of infantry and armor. Because not only does he have 2 infantry divisions for this attack, but he also has 2 British armored divisions plus a Canadian armored brigade. So, he's got a mixed bag, and he just doesn't really understand it. Everything is methodical and plotting with him, as opposed to that idea of fingertip feel, the genuine fingertip feel of understanding, what's going on with your men in the front, how the enemy is working. It's like a boxing match, and he's just, he's not Muhammad Ali. He's not. Yeah. And he's just a big slugger who comes out, and the Germans are like Ali. They know how to dance. They can play rope-a-dope. They understand the art of it at this particular point.
I'm going to read a passage here and for people who don't know, and when they read the book, they'll know more. But basically, 325 young men advance across the wheat.
Yeah.
They go up over this cliff and they're gone.
Yeah.
And this is a passage from the book that I found pretty compelling. During the 4-hour ordeal, one Black Watch man fell every 12 seconds. Every 2 minutes, one Highlander died in the withering German fire as they pushed up the ridge in a bid to fulfill their duty to higher authority, honor, the regiment, manhood, and, as some would say, destiny. So, you know, what happened? They just disappear.
Well, that's the thing. You know, you can imagine being in the head of the Black Watch Command at this time. Unfortunately, part of the reason why they were delayed is because they lost their commanding officer, Stuart Cantley. He was mortally wounded, and his 2IC, or the guy who acted like his 2IC, was also knocked out.
Second in command, right?
Second in command, yeah. Sorry, the old army in me is coming out. And
I'm good for translating that. It's a great
from army to English. Thank you. So there's a bit of a paralysis because there's a vacuum of power. There's an argument going on between who's going to take over. Finally, there's a young major who comes in and takes over. His name is Phil Griffin. He goes down in history because he ends up leading them up the ridge. But the Black Watch officers do consider not going, not following orders. In other words, they're looking for any legitimate way to get out of this attack, and they can't find it because they're under a direct order and the pressure is coming down. Get on, you're late, keep going. And then finally, the brigadier issues them a direct order. You go now. And of course, when you're dealing with a regiment like the Black Watch, even though in hindsight we would say that, yes, common sense should have dictated, you're playing with something that is much more, powerful. And that's the concept of honor with these men. Mm-hmm. These men had grown up, listening to the stories. They not only had to hold the regiment's name high, but also the names of their families. And that is quite powerful. And really, we're kind of in a transitional phase where we're no longer, by the end of World War II, looking at warfare and leadership and et cetera like that. But the Black Watch are still kind of the old guard, if you will. And they're the slaves to their past. And it's an albatross around their neck. So as a result, eventually, they realized, look, there's no legitimate way of getting out of this and saving face. So reluctantly, they do order the attack to go ahead. And they're just basically crossing their fingers that the artillery arrives on time, that the tanks arrive on time. But of course, as you probably know, coordinating artillery is the most difficult thing in an attack. So whenever that is done, you're kind of wed to that timetable. And so as that time, H hour, approaches, and now they're going to go up in broad daylight, the Germans are on 3 sides. So they're on both flanks and they're up on the other side of the ridge. The only thing they have is that artillery fire plan, really, and the tanks. So when the H hour comes at 09:30, Phil Griffin gives the order to go, even though the tanks haven't arrived. And so the tanks are late, and it's inexplicable. It seems like there was an order, a counter order, somebody called off the tank support. All the things that you could fear would happen in the fog of war and battle happen. So, I mean, it's probably, if you want to truly learn lessons, whether it be at, the War College, Staff College, or whatever else, you have to understand what happens to the Black Watch and all that entire dynamic, how it unfolds. So, yes, they do. They start marching, and they go up in what is called box formation. 2 rifle companies up, 2 rifle companies behind. The tanks are supposed to be on the flanks. They haven't materialized. And the artillery is coming down, but it's coming down on the reverse slope, and they can't see it. So as a result, a lot of the men mistakenly believed that the artillery never showed up. It did, but it was nowhere near as effective as they hoped it was going to be. So basically, the Germans just stood there and watched them come, and they started moving up from a little town called Saint-Martin into the wheat field. And they started moving up the wheat field, basically at a walking pace, as you normally would do to keep command and control, particularly in wheat. You go to ground in wheat, you lose everybody. So as they're going up, occasionally there was some plunging sniper fire, and then the machine guns, German machine guns, opened up. And of course, as you can imagine, the pace starts to quicken a little bit. Command and control is becoming very, very difficult as the NCOs and the officers, the platoon commanders are yelling to their NCOs are yelling to their section commanders, and they're trying to keep their men together. But now, men are starting to fall. Men are starting to scream. They're screaming for stretcher bearers. And then, boom, in comes the artillery, the mortars, the rockets, direct tank fire from 3 different sides. I mean, you mentioned Pickett's charge. It's the charge of the Light Brigade by this time.
And there's no cover.
There is absolutely no cover. What you're showing, the picture that you've been showing is not Verrières. It's a little bit, that's actually a little bit north of Caen. But put it this way, that's Verrières if you just tilt it up slightly.
Give it a ridge.
That's it.
Right, give it a little ridge.
And that's how open it is. So you have nowhere to go except to your objective. I'm
gonna quote from your book, so it's okay. You can be good. But there's 2 quotes here that really struck me as they're setting out, and one is from a German tank commander, Peter Prien, who is on their flank and who is pouring horrendous fire into their position. But he said it looked like waves of men rolling steadily forward, no sign of panic despite their visible losses. To us soldiers with 4 or 5 years of experience, this was a most unreal sight. So he can't even believe that they're doing this, and this is the enemy. And I would balance that, as you do in the book, because they're on virtually the same page, with a quote from Bruce Ducat, if I'm saying his name correctly.
Ducat.
Ducat. And he said his description puts you right in the moment. The first thing you noticed was how loud it was. Machine guns firing, bullets whipping through the grain that sounded like wasps, shells landing, men shouting orders and wounded screaming, screeching metal and the clang of bullets and shell fragments meeting body armor, shovels, picks or helmets, and then the smell of the cordite from the blast. It just stunk.
Yeah. Bruce, I was very lucky when I started doing the interviews for this book. I was a young officer 30 years ago in the regiment, and when I used to go in, they were still around. I mean, the men would have been in their 60s at that time, and I was very lucky when they found out that I was quite serious about military history, that, in addition to, my very short time in the Army, that my career was definitely going to be in history. I was able to gain their confidence, and I was able to sit down with many of them over several years, decades actually, and get their story down, and Bruce was something else. Bruce was very open about everything. He had his vision, and of course, as a historian, you're challenged with that because everybody's got particularly an infantryman, 50 yards wide, 50 yards deep. That's their war, right? Everything that happens. And so they're all puzzle pieces, and we have to bring these puzzle pieces together. But what was interesting was that Bruce's description is almost universal with everybody who was there. And whether it's the sight, the smell, the sound, and a lot of them really talked about the sound. And it was, the last thing they wanted to hear was the clang of metal because they knew something was hit. It was one thing when the bullets went by and they sounded like wasps, but it was another thing when you'd hear a thunk or you'd hear a twang or a pang because you knew it had struck something. And that was the tough part. And then, of course, the artillery. The artillery coming down, and they're facing everything from 210 millimeter rocket shells to 150 millimeter high explosive. They're getting 81 millimeter mortars dropping in. I mean, it's a carefully crafted killing ground. It's almost textbook. It's right out of German doctrine. And unfortunately, the tank support didn't materialize as it should have. And the artillery was relatively ineffectual. And so, right from the start, even if things did come together, I really don't see how they would have been able to make it up. And so by the time they actually reached the crest of the ridge, out of the 325 men who start the assault, only 60 are left. That's it. And only 60 make it across. And out of the 325, less than 20 make it back the next day to be able to report fit for duty. So 129 men are killed and a whole bunch are wounded, and others are taken prisoner of war. And some of them are lucky. They end up in, German hospitals in France that, in the next couple of weeks are overrun and they come home. But Bruce Duckett doesn't. Bruce Duckett ends up in a German prisoner of war camp right until the end, as well as some of the others.
So, Dave, on that attack, they suffered 97% casualties. They've lost a company crossing the Orange. So, in your book, it's first 7 days of combat, they suffer 72% casualties.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, two questions really. One is, how does the regiment basically continue to function, because they go on and they finish the war, so they're reconstituted. And then moving on from that, why don't we, the collective we, know more about this? I mean,
Okay.
if you go to
Okay, two great questions.
you go to Newfoundland Park, there's always buses there, right? The Newfoundland Regiment, their moment on July 1st. We all
From
know
World
about
War One, right?
From World War One,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah. We all know about Company A on Omaha Beach.
Yeah.
This is. I just,
I would argue it's kind of a travesty. It's fallen through the cracks, and there's a reason for that. And let me get to your first question first,
Yeah.
and then we'll come back to that. I mean, the first question is, the Black Watch is not the only one to suffer heavily. I mean, they suffer the most, but the entire 2nd Division and also 3rd Division suffer very heavily in this bid to get Verrières Ridge and Operation Spring. As a matter of fact, there's 3 big operations that are put on before the Canadians and the British finally get Verrières Ridge. So you have Operation Atlantic on the 18th, you have Spring on the 25th, and finally Operation Totalize on the 8th of August, which actually brings the ridge in. But there are there's a disproportionate amount of infantry casualties that the Canadian Army had not prepared to make good. And as a matter of fact, that was one of the big problems. Most of the casualties they figured would come into the ranks of the armor, believe it or not. So as a result, when you finish the Battle of Verrières, you are short on infantry reinforcements. And the Black Watch literally starts scraping the barrel to get whatever they can, and so does the Canadian Army. So by the time you reach, late summer, early fall, you are getting a massive reconversion. So people who were in light anti-aircraft, bakers, candlestick makers, shoemakers, are now being thrust into the front lines and being retrained very quickly to be infanteers. So it has a dramatic impact also on the Black Watch, because some people have said that is pretty much the end of the territorial exclusivity of the Black Watch. It really is no longer a Montreal regiment after Verrières, because now you have to recruit from right across Canada and anywhere else to fill those ranks. And I would argue it's not a bad thing, to be honest with you. We get some of the best and brightest people from across the country associated with the regiment, but at the same time, you have to remember that a lot of the men that were coming in, particularly to the Black Watch, because they suffered the most, were rather reluctant to be there. They didn't sign on to be carrying a rifle in a frontline infantry. They were trained to fire an anti-aircraft weapon, or trained as engineers or medics or whatever else, and now they're being thrust into the front line. But I think, to get to your second question, one of the reasons why we don't tend to look at this is because it is a painful chapter. But it sounds weird because Dieppe we commemorate all the time. But I think part of this also had to do with the end of the war, with politics and with history. And remember that Guy Simonds continues on in command. He continues on throughout all of Northwest Europe. And when he finishes being the senior corps commander in the Canadian Army, he expects to be the first Canadian chief of the general staff as soon as the war is over. The Army commander, Harry Creer, is retiring. Everybody expects Harry's just going to tap him on the shoulder. But of course, people don't realize, except if you're in the Army in high command, that Creer and Simonds hate each other. There is a Simonds and a Creer clique, and there's no mixing. It's like prison gangs. You just don't deal with each other. So as a result, Charles Foulkes, our division commander, remember the one who was fantastic at brown nosing? Well, he ends up being selected by Creer as the first chief of the general staff after the war, which Simonds considers to be a massive slap in the face. And so as a result, when the history of this is starting to be written in the end of the war in mid 1945 and into 1946, Simonds is smarting. Simonds realizes he will never become chief of the defense staff unless he massages his legacy. And he starts doing this, sadly, with what happens here at Verrières. He refuses to accept responsibility for his plan. He blames it, and unfortunately, he does have a reputation for doing this, blaming his subordinates, particularly ones that die and can't answer back. And so he ends up blaming the fate of the Black Watch on the Black Watch themselves. And so as a result, he starts meddling. We have, kind of like SLA Marshall and, your official historians in the United States. We had a fantastic one by the name of C.P. Stacy, Colonel Stacy, who you probably read. If you read anything on Canadians in Normandy, you know it's Stacy. Stacy had a historical team working on this. And Stacy was in a very difficult position because even though he was a professor of history, I think he was at Yale, as a matter of fact, when he joined the Army, he was actually a colonel subject to the chain of command. So there's complete conflict of interest when it comes to Simmons, because Simmons was asking for his reports, his historical reports, and of course the narrative he was writing. And then he would write back to Stacy and say, nah, I don't like this. Please downplay this, change that, do this. So he actively
That's how good history is written, right?
Well, yeah, and to be honest with you, the reason that we know about this and the reason that I could challenge this and take this on is because C.P. Stacy understood what the hell was happening, and he put everything in his diary, which was brilliant.
Yeah.
In other words, he left
Don't mess with a historian.
We'll mess your legacy up forever.
Oh,
Don't mess with historians. So anyway, that's what he ended up doing. But part of it was the damage was done. In other words, Verrières Ridge was considered to be a real negative thing. It was horrible. It was the second deadliest day next to Dieppe. But, it was one of those things where, the war eventually, 2 weeks later, hey, the Germans collapsed in Normandy. There were better things on the horizon, if you will. And it kind of got swept under the rug.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did.
But yeah. I was just going to say, look, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but as we're getting close here, but I want to just, we talked about casualties, and we talked about the numbers, and 97% casualties that day, and out of 300 men, 126 killed, and the rest wounded, taken prisoner. And there's a great visual that you have in your book, and I'm going to throw it up here. And this is just the officers, the officers of the Black Watch, taken in May 1944, 2 months before this, and you can see a K for those who are killed, a W for those who are wounded. And that's your visual. Those are your leaders, those are your officers, and that tells the whole story to me. This is just a nightmare.
Yeah, that's the price in the officer corps for 7 days in Normandy for the Black Watch, right there. And it's amazing to think about it because, we were a relatively small country. We still are, potent, but small. And, we only had 8 million people, yet we had close to 800,000 men in uniform and women in uniform at that time. So 1 in 10 was walking around in a uniform. So you can imagine what it was like for the post-war, when you have these people who would eventually go on to be not only the captains of industry, but professors and politicians and the leaders in society who are being just mowed down on these fields. It's very similar to what, the lost generation out of Great Britain at the end of World War I. What could these men have done? How would Canada have been different? Maybe it would be better, maybe it would be worse, but it would have been different for sure. And, we tend to forget that. And it's the same thing with the United States. A whole generation, a whole generation of leaders, of innovators, thinkers, they're all lost.
Well, I was going to wrap up, Chris, unless you have a last question you want to ask.
I was just going to tell everybody to please read the book, find out about this part of the Normandy campaign.
Yeah, we have really just scratched the surface,
Yeah.
and this is still only one part of the Canadian campaign. We talked with Tim Cook a couple of weeks ago about some of Canada's efforts, and I think all of our audience knows a lot more about and can appreciate a lot more about what Canada did during World War II. It's pretty amazing stuff. So, David O'Keefe, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour. I hope you.
Thank you for having me.
Hope you were able to finish your single malt there. And,
Getting there. I'm getting there.
If not, you can. And again, his book is 7 Days in Hell. Canada's battle for Normandy and the rise of the Black Watch snipers, which is a whole other interesting part of this story. So, and there's a documentary as well that you can find on YouTube about the Black Watch snipers, and David's part of that as well. So, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, guys.
Next week we'll be back live.
But still in Normandy.
I won't be in Normandy yet.
No, but I mean, like in Normandy, like as far as a topic.
Yes, because we're going to talk about Daniel Taylor's new book of Valor,
Yes.
which talks about Operation Perch, the British offensive from June 7th to 14th. It included Villers Bocage and, of course, the exploits of
Michael Wittmann,
Nazi tank commander
Yes,
Michael
nastiest
Wittmann,
Nazi tank commander Michael Wittmann.
one of your favorites.
Yeah, he's a real swell guy.
He's yeah.
Well, watch the show and learn all about
He's
why
a bit of a folk hero, perhaps not appropriately.
Yes, well, find out more. No, it's a really good book, and lots of insights on a pretty important battle that has a lot more going on than just Michael Wittmann. So it should be a good show.
Excellent. Well, looking forward to that, and it's got lots of pictures. So I mean, I'm always up for a book with lots of pictures.
I know.
I've
Then the week after that,
written 6 of them. So.
I know, but so I think after that though, we should have a book with lots of pictures that's like scratch and sniff. You remember those?
I do remember, but I we can work on a topic where we can do scratch and sniff picture books.
I think like another one of those
It's
American history through cakes books.
If it's a scratch and sniff of Normandy,
Yeah, no, that wouldn't be
it
good.
might not smell very well.
That wouldn't be good. Good, fair point.
Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast.
Podcast. Hey, can't take the boy out of Boston.
Listen to the podcast. They back us on Patreon. Browse historyhappyhour.com.
Yeah, and all that stuff. Thanks, everybody. Be safe.